Peach and Love Records.
During another of her husband's extended stints abroad, a very pregnant Julia Lennon packed her tiny suitcase and checked into the maternity hospital in Oxford Street. Just after 7 o'clock the next morning, on October 9th, 1940, with Liverpool under heavy bombing from the Nazis, John Winston Lennon was born. John quickly grew into a very clever, dreamy little boy. By the time John was 3 years old, Freddie and Julia had called it quits, and John went to live with his Auntie Mimi Smith and Uncle George in Woolton. Julia had met another man by the name of John Dykins, says Mimi. Taking John would have been very difficult for her, so I offered to look after him myself. Leela Harvey, John's first cousin, was perhaps Lennon's closest friend and confidant up until the age of 15. She remembers the controversy surrounding John's earliest days.
Mimi said to her, and I was in the room, and Mimi will not deny it, you are not fit to have this child. She wanted to take John to live with Bobby there. And he said, no, you're not. And Mimi wanted him. He was a very sweet little boy, you know, very cute, very pretty, as you can see his photograph there. And she wanted him. Mimi didn't have children. She said, no, you're not having him. You're not fit to have this boy, because you've gotten somebody else. And he stayed there.
In an exclusive 1986 conversation between Paul McCartney and John's younger sister Julia Baird, Paul recalled the much misunderstood Auntie Mimi.
At first you might think a bit cantankerous, you know, a bit sort of cantankerous, I mean, but she wasn't. She had a twinkle with it. She was one of these women, as I say, just good and forthright. I like that in women. I like them to stand up for themselves, you know.
John's first school was Dovedale Primary. He was a cheerful boy, full of fun and mischief, who impressed both schoolmates and teachers with his natural leadership and naughty sense of adventure. He was also quite creative. By the age of 7, he was even writing his own books. One of them, Sport, Speed, and Illustrated, edited by J.W. Lennon, contained a witty collection of poems, caricatures, and short stories that hinted at his talent as a writer with a keen sense of the absurd. Lennon's sister Julia comments on John as a big brother.
Very noisy, bouncing up and down, very good with the girls. That's me and my sister. He was just a brother hanging around the house, really.
When he was just 12, John left Dovedale for Quarrybank Grammar School, just a mile or so away from his auntie's house on Menlove Avenue. John's years at Quarrybank were characterized by the consistent academic failure and random creative achievement of a young man struggling with the seed of genius sown in the soil of middle-class conformity. Shortly after the death of John's Uncle George in 1953, his mother Julia re-entered his life. Although John heard very little about her whereabouts over the years, he often wondered about her and secretly wished he could see her again. Then, when he found out that she lived just a few short miles away in Allerton with her common-law husband John Dykins, whom John preferred to call Twitchy, and their daughters Julia and Jackie, he was thrilled. Once again, Paul looks back at John's relationship with his charismatic mother Julia.
I always thought she was a very beautiful lady and a really nice woman, and I know John absolutely adored her. One, obviously on the level that she was his mum, so he just was totally bonded to her, I mean, for that. But also because she was like a very beautiful woman and a very spirited woman, you know, as I say, we were talking before, she taught him banjo. Now, I mean, it's very sort of gay in the old sense of the word.
Yeah.
You know, she's very lively, a very fun person, very lively woman. I remember her long red hair. I remember her being sort of very good looking, as I say. Full of life, yeah.
Julia encouraged John in whatever he wanted to do. But most of all, it was Julia's knowledge of popular American music that turned on John and his pals. Leela Harvey recalls John's first major musical influence.
She played the banjo. Of course, he got his ear from Judy. If she was going out, she would get her banjo and she would sing things. Like she sang like, what's the Vera Lynn voice?
In early 1956, John and his friends Eric Griffiths, Len Gary, Colin Hanton, Pete Shotton, and Rod Murray got together and formed a skiffle group they called the Quarrymen. Named in honor of Quarry Bank Grammar School, the group played its first gig at the annual Empire Day celebrations on Rosebery Street. Meanwhile, having long since swapped the old trumpet his dad had given him for a guitar, Paul McCartney was making progress. Always the perfectionist, he practiced everywhere, in the lavatory, in the bathtub, on the bus, or even at school. Ivan Vaughan, an old schoolmate of John's, had recently met and befriended Paul McCartney. On June 15, 1956, the two boys went together to see the Quarrymen perform at an outdoor party at the Woolton Parish Church. For the first time anywhere, Paul McCartney recounts his initial meeting with John.
First time I met John was at Woolton Village Fete. And I'd been invited there by Ivan, who was our mutual mate.
Ivan Vaughan.
Ivan Vaughan, yeah. He's born on exactly the same day as me, Ivy, 18th of June 1942, so we've always had a lot in common as well as that, I mean, besides that as well.
So you were Ivan's friend before John was?
So, no.
Or you were mutual
Ivan,
without knowing each other?
John lived in Mendips, Ivan lived behind Mendips, the sort of Gardner way or somewhere, so they were mates from where they lived. Ivan was my mate from school, and he said, do you want to come to the Woolton Village Fete? You know, a couple of the lads are going to be there and stuff, and I'll take you. So I was, I think, about younger than 16, I think, because I think John was about 16. I think I was maybe about 14 and a half, 15.
Well, I know we all went up to that fete. Nanny came over with Michael, Harry, me, Jackie, John, my mother. We all went to see John playing.
That's right, he was playing on the...
So what year was that then?
Good question.
Paul was impressed with what he heard and remembers John singing the Dell Vikings' Come Go With Me.
Yeah, so I'd been invited there by Ivan, and he took us along, and I remember sort of coming into the village fete like you do, you sort of enter the field it's all on, you know, it's all side shows.
Scouts and cubs and everything.
Cubs and side shows and that. And music, you know, from these little tannoy system. And it was John and the band, and they had, what was it? It was John, Len Gary, Pete Shotton, Colin Hanton on drums, Griff on guitar, and maybe Nige Wally, who was like officially manager, but he managed to get up on the stage. Thanks, okay. Anyway, but he was a good lad.
Away.
So I remember, I was amazed. I mean, I saw the band and I thought, oh great, well I'll listen to the band because I was into the music and that. And Ivan said, you know, I know a couple of the lads in the band, these are my mates.
Had you not gone along to sing yourself?
No. I'd just come as a guest in the fete with Ivan. We were in the audience watching. I remember John singing his own words of a song called Come and Go With Me, because we'd heard it on the radio. He'd heard it on the radio. I say I had two in my house, but I didn't know he knew it yet. And it was a lovely song by the Dell Vikings called Come and Go With Me. And he didn't know the verses, but he knew the come, go with me, you know, little darling, come go with me. But
so
then
you
there's
supplied the words.
So he did his own little words, which were good. They were like from blues things, down to the penitentiary, all this stuff, you know, like bluesy. Come on, go with me, which weren't on the real record. And I remember at the time he was playing banjo chords on his guitar, because as fellas look at other fellas' fingers and kind of say, what's he playing there?
Well, of course, our mother had taught him to play the banjo. That's
what it was.
Yeah.
I thought John was good.
Yeah.
He was really the only outstanding member. All the rest slipped away. You know, the drummer was pretty good, actually, for what we knew. Then Col Hanton was good. And he had some... See, this is one of the reasons I know they liked Col was I think he had the record Searching.
Oh, yeah.
And that was big currency, you see. Yeah. And then afterwards, after they'd finished playing, Ive took us up to the church hall, just behind the church. So it was like up the hill a bit from where the fete was, yeah. We went up there, and... By now, they were the band, and they'd finished their set, so they were kind of, you know, having a beer. It wasn't crazy drinking or anything, but it was just like social, bit of fun. And I remember John looking, I mean, we used to really think John looked kind of pretty cool, because he was a bit older than us, and he would do a little bit more greased back hair than we were allowed. You know, our parents had really I just didn't dare do it. It was just like that, you know, in the way my dad was, you know, really. So John was kind of, you know, quite groovy. He looked a bit of a Ted then. He did have a drape.
Oh, yeah.
He was, you know, he was pretty cool. He had nice big sideburns, as we called them. Sideboards. Or Elvis called them sideburns. So it was the American one. So I remember him just leaning over me, and we were around the piano in the church hall, and there was a couple of guitars. And on the guitar, which I think must have been backwards, but I had a mate from the Dingle who had a guitar, so I was a little bit used to even playing, turning the guitar upside down. I played a bit of 20 Flight Rock, and I knew a lot of the words, and that was like very good currency in those days. I mean, I realise now, then you just knew the words, and they just really wanted to be getting the words to that song. Like he hadn't got them to come go with me. That was one of the big things then. How'd you get the words, man? You know, well, I know a fella who lives in Bootle, and if you take a bus to him, he knows B7.
Yeah.
What? And we'd all pile on the bus to go and learn a chord, you know, like almost. And the words were the same, you know, so it's a great thing if anyone knew the full words to 20 Flight Rock, and I'd learned them up, I got the record. And then I got asked to join the group, I think on the strength of knowing 20 Flight Rock. And I think I also sang Long Tall Sally as well. Those were my two little... Long Tall Sally was my Little Richard thing. I still do. I was doing it last year. Yeah. And the Eddie Cochran is the 20 Flight Rock thing, and it was the words there. That was the really hip thing, you know. I got a girl with a wrecking machine. You know, great words, all those early rock and roll. So that was lovely. That was the first time I met John.
Then, in early 1958, Paul introduced George to the Quarrymen, and more important to music history, to John. By the time George had become a bona fide member of the Quarrymen, things had begun to look up for the band. But personally, John Lennon was undergoing difficult times. On July 15th, 1958, his free-spirited mother, Julia, was knocked down by a car and killed while crossing Menlove Avenue. Though Leela had long since moved away from home, she still kept in close touch with her family. Here she recounts hearing the tragic news of Julia's death.
Got a telegram. I remember it exactly. Judy, car accident, died, car accident Friday, funeral Tuesday. I just dropped everything. Oh, I think, poor John.
McCartney, too, remembers the sad occasion and the effect it had on his mate, John.
When you look back, all you kind of see is a word sort of something like tragedy or something written in black. You just don't see much more. And the only way we could help was that I'd had the same thing happen to me. So I couldn't really help him or say anything. But you know, it's a funny little thing. It's funny, it's kind of cruel, but it's boys and it's teenage. Was the thing I really remember was that a year or so after it, when he was not getting over it, because I don't think you get over things like that, but the shell was returning. You know, he could bluff it out a bit better. The act was coming back together again. People would meet us together, and they'd sort of say, and how's your mum then? And I'd say, she died just a few years ago. And he'd have that. And we knew that people would go, I'm awfully sorry, oh my God. And we used to have a laugh about that. We kind of say, yeah, watch out, you know, look at this. You know, it wasn't kind of cruel, it was a way of masking our real feelings. But that gave us a little bit of a bond, you know, we'd kind of say, oh God, here we go, look, he's going to ask, how's your mum? And then, oh no, and we'd both kind of laugh as the person wriggled with embarrassment. It was a thing we both knew about. That I don't think you help each other with that, but it gave us some little link where we could have a little laugh and relieve our own pain, I suppose.
Around this time, John left his aunt's pleasant, decidedly middle-class home and moved into a very shabby one-room flat at 3 Gambier Terrace with his good friend Stuart Sutcliffe. John was now attending classes at the Liverpool College of Art and soon began playing occasional lunchtime sessions with his group, now renamed the Silver Beatles, in the student lounge. Sister Julia, meanwhile, recalls that John was certainly no scholar.
He rebelled against school. He didn't like the uniformity of it. It wasn't for him. He rebelled against art school as well by not working when he got there. I don't know what he would have done if he hadn't broken into music.
Asked about John's relationship with Cynthia, Paul had this to say.
Cyn was John's original girlfriend at art school, and it was the time when you wanted to turn your girlfriends into Bridget Bardot. So we both turned
John
on.
adored Bridget Bardot.
I know,
anyway.
we all did. But, you know, we were all just at the age for a sex goddess to be there taking her clothes off. Like I say, you know, at that age, there's no contest. something as gorgeous as that. You know, you just, oh, hello. And we were smitten, all of us. And so, but all the girls preferably had to be sort of blonde and look like Bridget and pout a lot. So I know John and I kind of had these sort of little secret talks where we kind of intimated that we were, without saying it actually, you know, it sounds crass when you say it, but the idea was to sort of turn your girlfriend into Bridget Bardot, Liverpool's answer to. So my girl was Dorothy Rowan I was going out with, and John was going out with Cynthia, and we kind of didn't sort of double date, but we were both going out with girls at the same time. And I think we got them both to go blonde and wear miniskirts.
After tiring of being known as the Quarrymen, the group had briefly been called Johnny and the Moondogs. John and Paul even performed a few gigs under the unlikely name of the Nurk Twins. By this time, the group had gone through a succession of different drummers and had finally settled on a quiet, strangely good-looking fellow from West Derby by the name of Pete Best. Tony Mansfield, drummer for Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, who now shared Brian Epstein as a manager with the Fab Four, remembers the early leather-clad Beatles at the Cavern.
I heard them do Love Me Do a few times, and which was completely different, obviously, in the drumming and everything, because Pete Best was with the group at that time. When we first knew the Beatles and played with them, this is 1962 now, the end of 61, 62. So they'd had a lot of numbers actually written, right? Their act was did a lot of rock and roll, a lot of favourites like The Crowd Like Hippie Shake and things like that. They used to do that, and Mr. Moonlight, you know, by Dr. Feelgood and the Interns, you know. Paul did quite a few Little Richard things like, you know, Oh My Soul and things like that. I don't think he did Oh My Soul. They were very entertaining, especially on a lunchtime session, because it was more laid back, because people, you know, a lot of people were out of work. And I always remember John walking up to the stage with his butty in his hand and a cup of tea in the other, you know, and coming out with comments like, I was going to finish my butty first, you know, and things like that, and all the girls, you know, and the fans, you know, would start to, you know, shouting out to John, you know, and John would come out with all these wisecracks. And they also used to do commercials, you know, from the television, you know, like, Omo washes, not only white, not only da-da-da, you know, and, you know, they sort of worked something out, the three of them, you know, and they're just farting around, you know.
Almost from the very beginning, Paul admired John for his cool worldliness and staunchly middle-class upbringing. Here he remarks on a hitchhiking trip the two boys made to Paris.
We went to Paris. It was supposed to be Spain, but we couldn't get past Paris. We enjoyed that so much. On the strength of his 100 quid when he was 21. We went hitchhiking. We kind of said, well, look, I mean, we can get to Spain on this, you know, 100 quid, you know, and he was kind of, you know, I don't think he was funding me so much as he was spending.
Yeah. And
I'd be there for the banana milkshake. You know, I just happened to be there while he was spending, you know. I think I kind of paid my own way, but we hitched down. And we realised that in hitching, in those days, was much safer, obviously, than it is to hitchhike now, I mean. And we realised you had to have a bit of a gimmick, so we both had these leather jackets, and we had got bowler hats. We thought, that'll take the edge off the kind of hoodie look, you know, the sort of ruffian look. These bowlers, and then you kind of go, wait, and people stop, you know, because there's a couple of daft guys in bowler hats, you know, they don't look like a threat. So we hitched down south. Hoekvin Holland or somewhere, Harwich, Hoekman Holland, somewhere like that. Got over to Paris anyway, got a bit drunk on the French beer. It was great, because we'd been drinking beer, the British stuff, and we felt we could handle that, but this foreign stuff really went to our heads. So we had a kind of quite fun crossing there. It was great, it was so adventurous. I'd never done anything like that. I'd hardly ever been out of Liverpool. I'd been to Pwllheli, Skegness and Leamington Spa. That had been the whole of my travels, you know. So it was very exciting just to get off on your own with like a mate like John.
Alan Williams, an aggressive, fast-talking Scouser with a keen eye for a fast buck, was the first real promoter to take an interest in the Silver Beatles. He liked the boys personally and figured they might one day even have a shot at becoming professional. Acting on their behalf, he negotiated a deal for them to appear in Hamburg at Bruno Koschmider's Indra Club. The Beatles played Hamburg twice during a short period, from August to December 1960 and from April to July of 1961. Paddy Delaney, the big-hearted bouncer at the Cavern Club, was especially good friends with Lennon. That is, until one fateful encounter.
The Beatles were on tour. It was one of the first major tours of the country. I went up to the Blue Peter, run by Alan Williams, and I saw the back of this fellow sitting on the stool by the bar. He had a light blue mohair jacket, suit. And I walked up, I said, no, that can't be. It looks very much like it, but it can't be. It was John Lennon sitting at the bar. He had a scotch in front of him. Now I remember when they were sharing 2 pints of bitter, that's 2 beers between 4 of them, and taking a sip out of it each and passing the glasses round. Hello, John. What the hell are you doing here? Hello, Pat. Having a drink. It's a typical answer from John Lennon. You know, nothing about the tour, just having a drink. As if he didn't have to answer for anything. No, he said, you'll have a double scotch. I said, John, I'm having my supper. I'm going home now. This is the usual thing. Oh, so this is where you get yourself. This is the way he carried on. We had a double scotch. And one thing led to another. He paid for the glass of bitter. He paid for the double scotch after that, and the double scotch after that, and the double scotch after that. Now, when I'd entered the Blue Angel, it was 12 o'clock. And 4:30 on a bright summer's morning, I practically thrown out the taxi outside my door, and I was told that I was shouting all over the place, I'll get you, Lennon, on Saturday night. I'll break your bloody neck. Because I had to go to work at 8 o'clock, and I would have had a full night's sleep. He's giggling all over the place, falling all over the cab, laughing his head off. But as it turned out on Saturday night, it was arms round each other, just laughing and joking about what happened on Thursday.
It was hard to believe that when he first took over the Beatles, that Brian had been unable to interest any of the major record labels, and that it was only by the luckiest of coincidences that he landed a deal with Parlophone. As time went by, it became apparent that despite his popularity, Pete Best didn't really have a future as a Beatle, and so local drummer Ringo Starr was brought in to replace him. Tony Mansfield remembers.
Even though Pete wasn't a particularly good drummer, very good-looking boy, but he just didn't seem to fit in physically, or even mentally, as you found out later, with the boy's sense of humour or the music. He wasn't good music. I'm talking now as a drummer about another drummer. I thought he was a beautiful person. He really was, Pete, a real gentleman. And that goes for all the boys. They were very polite and they were nice to work with.
Now, everywhere the Beatles went, they were pursued by hordes of screaming, crying, swooning young women. Father Tom Mackenzie, known affectionately as the inspiration behind The Lonely Cleric and Eleanor Rigby, recalls his first encounter with Cynthia Lennon.
One of the questions I was asked, are the boys married? Now, I didn't know much in the early days about the personal aspects of the boys, until one night a young lady come and stood on the stage, and I said, I'm very sorry, but you can't stand on the stage, you have to go downstairs. She said, well, I've got permission from a gentleman in a grey suit down below. Well, I knew that chap in the grey suit was Mr. Buckley, the promoter, so I went and checked with Mr. Buckley. And I said, is it true that you've let a lady come up on the stage? He says, yes. He said, that's Cynthia Lennon. I went up and apologised to her, but this was the first time I knew John was married. And I always kept it to myself. When the girls asked me down below, the young girls, is John married? I'd say, I don't know. I never leaked it out. It wasn't that John denied he wasn't married. It was that the girls in those days thought he wasn't married, but he never denied it, you see.
Tony Mansfield, too, shares some insight on Lennon's personal life.
John was very quiet about Cynthia. No one was supposed to know about her, and I never talked to John about initially when we first met the Beatles. we never got involved in each other's personal lives. We were working.
Julia Baird remembers the initial onslaught of Beatlemania.
We all went to Beatlemania, if you like. But we all had school to go to. I was doing my exams at school and stuff like that. We were just that bit too much younger to get totally involved in it because we had commitments at home and at school. But we all sort of lost touch with him, physically lost touch with him when he went to America.
As the Beatles toured the United States, the pattern of lunacy that constantly surrounded them began to take its toll. Alistair Taylor, the Beatles' longtime personal assistant and Apple executive, looks back on the early days of the Beatles' stellar success.
If you weren't there, you can't begin to understand the pressure and the way of life. I don't care a damn how many books you've read, how many people you interview, who says what. I can't convey to you what it was like. It was... I mean, I know, I was... Although I was close, I was under pressure, and I was not remotely in their league, and it was unbearable, and they had to do something. You imagine, you can't walk down the street, you can't go in a car, you can't do anything without being torn to shreds, day in, day out, night in, night out.
John's latter-day right-hand man, Richie York, recalls the non-stop madness of the Beatles' manic heyday.
And suddenly there were all these girls, 50, 60 girls tearing down the corridor after him, and they were crazy. And they got in the car and they were jumping on it and everything. I mean, it was just absurd.
What did John say? What would he say?
Well, he just thought it was normal. I mean, he was used to it, yeah.
What would they do if they caught him?
I don't know. It was pretty deadly trying to dodge it.
Was it frightening?
Yeah, it was. I mean, all these kids, who knew what was going to happen next? That element of it, I think, destroyed. Any chance they might have had, having any one-to-one relationships with fans. Very difficult.
Although things were going reasonably well for John, the dim specter of his runaway father Fred was always there in the back of his mind. Unfortunately, Lennon's worst fears came to fruition when, after the Beatles first made it, Fred Lennon suddenly reappeared.
The only thing I knew was that it was this great pity that he'd reappeared through a newspaper report, Sunday People or something, and he was Beatles' dad washes dishes in the Bear Hotel in Esher. And then I was with John at that time when he had to kind of out. Luckily, we had a good, robust nature because, bloody hell, isn't that typical? We could laugh it off like that, and he went to see him and everything. I don't think I ever met him.
But what was worse, what made it absolutely impossible for the Beatles to continue touring for any extended period of time, was the undeniable reality that in the midst of all this chaos, the audiences had forgotten the music. One of the most controversial situations John found himself in occurred when he offhandedly remarked to a journalist friend that, in his opinion anyway, the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. Quite predictably, all hell broke loose. Lennon later attempted to explain his side of the situation in a 1966 Beatles press conference.
I just never thought of repercussions. I never really thought of it. I wasn't even thinking, even though I knew she was interviewing me, that she was going to, that it meant anything.
What's your reaction to the repercussions?
Well, when I first heard it, I thought it can't be true. It's just one of those things like bad eggs in Adelaide and things. And then when I realised it was serious, I was worried stiff, because I knew sort of how it'd go on, and the things that would get said about it, and all those miserable-looking pictures of me looking like a cynic, and they'd go on and on and on, and it'd get out of hand, and I couldn't control it. I can't answer for it when it gets that big, because it's nothing to do with me then.
A disc jockey in Birmingham, Alabama, who really started most of the repercussions, has demanded an apology from you.
He can have it, I apologise to him if he's upset and he really means it. I'm sorry I said it, really, for the mess it's made. But I never meant it as a lousy or anti-religious thing or anything. And I can't say any more than that.
This was, all in all, quite a lot of madness for four provincial young men from the north of England to endure. And so it was that when the Beatles laid down their instruments after their last number at Candlestick Park in San Francisco in August of 1966, they said goodbye to public performing forever.
to me, I kind of, in a way, sort of played down the John and me thing. You know, I've never really tried to say, yeah, I'm the guy who wrote all the songs with him, I'm the guy who knew him the best. Well, I am. That's what I mean. And it's suddenly dawning on me that...
it was a partnership, wasn't it?
That's what I mean. From the days you're talking about, the days we're talking about, Walton Village, from then, we always were trying to write these little songs. We eventually succeeded on a minor level. Then we succeeded on a total mega level, you know.
As the Beatles' music developed, the themes in their songs became much more introspective and colorful. First, there was the meditative tone to Rubber Soul and Revolver, followed by the hallmark work, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Amongst the many gems included on the album was the controversial Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which many were certain spelled out the initials of the dreaded heaven and hell drug, LSD. In a rare 1984 interview with this author, Julian Lennon remembered the actual origin of the song.
Yeah, well, I came up the drive from school. I'd just been dropped off. And I was waddling along up to the house with this big picture in my hand, which was all water blurry, you know. I mean, how good can you paint a 5, you know? But I mean, it was just a school friend, Lucy, that I'd drawn in this picture. It was just green grass at the bottom and a dark blue sky at the top with very, very rough-looking stars, you know, and curly little blonde locks from my little school girlfriend, Lucy, you know. And Dad said, oh, what's that, you know? And I said, oh, that's Lucy in the sky, you know, diamonds.
As time went by, the Beatles became largely dissatisfied with the worldwide success that they had worked so hard to achieve. As a result, they absorbed themselves in several more esoteric pursuits, including experimentation with psychedelic drugs and even a brief fling with Indian guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. 60s superstar Donovan accompanied the boys on their trek to inner enlightenment. I spoke to him in 1985 about the experience.
All right, well, there's a nice story. We're all gathered together in Maharishi's bungalow, 4 Beatles, 1 Beach Boy, and Mia Farrow, and me. And Maharishi's on the floor sitting cross-legged, and we were all standing, and it was all we'd just arrived, and it was kind of an embarrassed silence in the room. And John Lennon's always the funny one, and he's a great wit, was a great wit and a great humorist. And in the silence, he decided to break the silence, and he walked up to Maharishi as he sat on the floor, and he patted him on the head, and he said, "There's a good guru."
For Paul, George, and Ringo, it may have been Yoko Ono's dramatic appearance on the scene that put the final nail in the group's coffin. Richie York remembers.
The Beatles were over, and Phil Spector was over remixing Let It Be. None of them even showed up at any of the sessions, right? None of them liked the album, but they didn't even, show up at the session. So you really can't blame Phil totally for that, fiasco. They couldn't be bothered doing, the sort of things, that John wanted to do. Like he'd write the Ballad of John and Yoko, right? And it'd be such a hassle to get them to record. They couldn't be bothered. They're off on holidays. They were into this or. They'd got that. I mean, the whole, drive of the group had gone, in 68, and it was, just a case of, Abbey Road was done with, each of the guys in the studio separately and everything. It was not a group effort. But John and Paul were never there together, ever, for that album, not once.
3 years after John's tragic passing, I spoke to Yoko Ono at the Dakota apartment home she shared with John, where she had this to say about the inspiration behind the Abbey Road classic, Because.
I was playing Moonlight Sonata, I think, and John said, "Oh, it's beautiful, beautiful. Could we just hear the chords and could we, play it from this end and all that, sort of backwards?" And he used a sort of chord progression from the back on. It worked, Well, it wasn't quite the reverse. It wasn't exact or anything. That was the inspiration, And yes, well, in classical music, chords are nothing really. We know all sorts of, we know all the chords, let's put it that way, right? But in the rock, I think, knowing some chord progression means a lot, So that's the kind of thing I learned. I thought, oh, you mean you don't know all the chords, It's very interesting. But, John knew a lot,
Another big problem for the boys was the rapid disintegration of their multi-million-pound Apple empire and the inevitable squabbles that ensued over how to manage it properly after Brian died. Alistair Taylor.
The boys. They were. They were stupid. You know, I mean, we all got accused of ripping them off, and of course there was stupidity, but they wouldn't listen. I tried to tell them this, and it was my idea that they eventually got Klein in. I didn't suggest Klein. I'm the guy that actually said to them one day, look, this is stupid. We cannot manage this business. Let me tell you something now. One Sunday, we were sitting in Hilly House, was it? Yes, Brian's private office, having a Apple meeting. The boys and myself and Neil. And they just picked up the phone there and then on a Sunday morning and said, hey, let's get hold of Derek. And they rang Derek Taylor in Los Angeles when he was with the Beach Boys and said, pack your bags, just come. And I said, well, what's he going to do? You know, oh, fuck that, I don't know, we'll find something. You know, and then when Derek arrived, and he said, okay, well, I'll set some kind of business up. And there was talk about making it one of these dispatch rider express delivery things. This literally happened. And then it came up, who we're going to have to run publishing. So Derek said, hey, there's this marvellous guy in it, get him on the phone, get him here. And they were just pulling people in and saying, oh, well, shit, what are we going to do with them? Oh, it doesn't matter, we'll think of something, you know. So is it any wonder money was flying out? They accused everybody else of ripping them off. But I mean, they just gave carte blanche. I mean, people buying genuine antique desks for their office, you know. I mean, and Ron Cass had this incredible all-white office, which cost the earth. I mean, it was unbelievable. Peter Asher had real old master paintings on his wall in his office. You know, I mean, it was just, oh, well, it's the Beatles, plenty of money, let's spend. You know, and we had this crazy idea of two cordon bleu chefs, you know, two girls. The idea was great. I mean, I went along with it very much. I think it was my idea, because the idea was, here we were, entertaining people, spending a lot of money in restaurants. And I said, look, this is much more sensible. Here we've got this beautiful house in Savile Row. Let's have our own cooks. They weren't, you know, they've been called chefs. There were two girls out of the Cordon Bleu school. Right. But it was never used for that. We still took people out for lunch, and the only people that dined there were Peter Brown and Neil Aspinall having, you know, 8-course lunches, you know, with Mouton Rothschild wine, you know, and there was this huge metal cabinet full of vintage wine and champagne. It was unbelievable. And you go in, and there they are, sitting there, no visitors. You know, yeah, great stuff, great stuff.
Tony Mansfield remembers the final dissolution of the Beatles as a group.
I think the people around them also had a lot to do with them being split up as well. You know, I mean, there's this thing with Alan Klein and with the Apple thing. You know, the boys had so much on the go for them, and they put trust into so many people, and so many people took them for a ride. That's, you know, it's like a business. It was getting out of hand. Well, it was a business. You know, I mean, look how much money the boys have generated. I think it was inevitable they had to split.
Musically, too, the boys had some very real troubles. George and Ringo were intent on busting out on their own and no longer felt the need to restrict their musical presence to the sometimes stifling boundaries of the Beatles' delicate framework. The Fabs were also becoming aware that their prolific output could no longer be easily contained on one or even two conventional LPs. Paul, ever the wide-eyed entertainer, found it increasingly difficult to identify with John and Yoko's avant-garde musical offerings and nearly hit the roof when, on November 29, 1968, they shed all remaining bonds of conformity by appearing nude on the cover of their Two Virgins LP. Richie York insists that towards the end, the Beatles meant very little to John.
I mean, John was only interested in the Plastic Ono band in his own individual situation. He didn't give a damn about the Beatles. I mean, you get the chart numbers from Billboard magazine early for him. You know, what he wanted to know was what the Plastic Ono were doing. He couldn't care about the Beatles. Who cares, he'd say. Beatles, yeah. Couldn't give a shit. Right. Paul did his best to, you know, persuade him that no, you know, hang in. You know, but John didn't want it. It was over.
Peter Brown, the Beatles' trusted aide and Apple manager, recalls the staff's initial reaction to Yoko.
Paul tried to dig Yoko. It wasn't possible to dig Yoko at the time, and she was thrust at us, and there was no way that you could take Yoko in those days.
It was natural for John and I to meet. I was in Trafalgar Square standing in a bag, saying that this was my peace statement or whatever, And when we got together, and John and I were one day sort of lying together, as usual, and sort of saying, oh, what about this and that, and what about the working class? And he was bringing out the working class a lot, just to sort of get to be, or you just sort of like let them eat cake. I was like, well, look, well, what did you do for peace? I mean, what was I doing standing in Trafalgar Square? Oh, I see, that's what you were doing? Okay, well, look, why don't we stand in Trafalgar Square together, in a bag? I said, okay, well, if you want to do it, you can do it. And then he said, no, well, that's a bit too much. Why don't we go in a Rolls, and bring out all these beautiful picnic sort of stuff, and just have a picnic in Trafalgar Square. That's more style, And I said, well, all right.
Despite the many difficulties, however, John and Yoko bounced back and were quietly married on March 20th, 1969, in a simple ceremony in Gibraltar. Peter Brown recalls the particulars of John and Yoko's unusual nuptials.
What people don't realize is, that John and Yoko were very hurt at that time because, they had been largely through their own fault. I mean, they'd made themselves the center of a circus, a media circus. And whatever they did was causing, derision in many ways. But the thing is that the romance and the relationship and the love between them was very sincere. And when they wanted to get married, they really wanted to get married in a special way. And Johnny wanted to get married quite a long time. I'd been in Holland once weekend, and he tried to call me up at home and found that I was in Holland and tracked me down in Holland and said, oh, that's a great idea. You stay in Holland and we'll come there and, we'll get married there. And I said, you can't do that. And then, of course, when Paul got married and it was a media circus, they were all the more determined not to go through that. And that's when he insisted with me, find somewhere fast, that I can get married without a problem. And that's when I discovered I tried everywhere. And I discovered that Gibraltar was in this peculiar situation of being part of the British setup, but far enough away and remote enough so that there wasn't a press corps.
Realizing that their celebrity status would never allow them the luxury of a truly private honeymoon, they jetted off to Amsterdam, where they announced plans to hold a 4-day bed-in for peace at the Amsterdam Hilton.
Well, why don't we just sit in the bed? Well, it's easier, isn't it? Because we were sitting in bed then, So what are we going to do? I invite the reporters announce them that we're just sitting in bed for peace, And then he started to see the windows, and came with bedroom, actually. I said, oh, but then all these reporters would be climbing up the window and everything, it'd be terrible. No, we won't do that. So then eventually, let's go to a hotel and do it. It was that,
Some months after the Montreal bed-in, John and Yoko held their first formal press conference at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto to announce plans for the John and Yoko Peace Festival to be held at Mossport Park in the summer. Ambling fearlessly into the lion's den dressed all in black, John and Yoko took their place center stage amongst the reporters and dived right into the session. Questioned on everything from what they thought about reincarnation to what type of toothpaste they preferred, the couple remained good-natured under the cross-examination and fielded many difficult inquiries with the aplomb of seasoned politicians.
We have a hard time making people think we mean what we say in Britain. I mean, we consider this that, like, we're in the cabin now, we're in that stage, we haven't got out of Liverpool yet with this campaign, and we've got to break London and then America, it's like that. And I feel exactly the same as I did then about the Beatles as I do about peace and what we're doing now, And I don't care how long it takes and what obstacles there are. We won't stop, Is
there any one incident that got you started on this peace campaign?
Well, it built up over a number of years, but a sort of thing that struck it off was we got a letter from a guy called Peter Watkins, who made a film called The War Game, and it was a long letter stating what's happening, who's got, how the media is controlled, how it's all run, everything that sort of everybody knows, that bit. But he sort of said it in black and white for hours and hours on pages, and it ended up, what are you going to do about it?
What are you
He
doing?
said sort of people in your position and our position, because he's a sort of filmmaker, have a responsibility especially to use the media for world peace. And we sat on the letter for 3 weeks thinking, well, we're doing our best, and all you need is love, man, and all that. But finally we came up and with the bed event after that, and that's what really sparked it off. It was like getting your call-up papers for peace. I'm scared to go into Vietnam and Biafra, and until I'm convinced that I do better there than I can do outside of it, I'll stay out. Like I'd go to Russia, but I'd think twice about China, because I don't want to be a martyr, and unless I'd like to play it safe, and be around.
How do you answer accusations that kind of thing is bordering on naivety, that it just isn't as simple as...
I don't think, let's see, if anybody thinks our campaign is naive, yes,
well, let's
see.
out.
If anybody thinks our campaign is naive, that's their opinion, and that's okay. Let them do something else, and if we like the idea, we'll join in with them, But otherwise, we do it the way we are. We're artists, and not politicians, not newspaper men, and not anything. We're artists. We do it in the way that suits us best, and this is the way we work. Like publicity and things like that is our game, because the Beatles thing was that, and that's the trade I've learned, and this is my trade, and I'm using it to the best of my ability.
Do you think something like hair as a source of entertainment that sells peace is effective?
I think that the hair thing probably did some good, I don't really know. I think it's all right, It was a nice, reflection.
I mean, everything counts as...
Everything positive is nice. I like it, Just the effect it had on people was good, I think.
You ever tried to pitch your colleagues on the Beatles into doing tours that are strictly peace-oriented?
Well, no, because this is the first time there's been an actual peace-oriented idea, a festival for peace. And I'll try and hustle them out, and if maybe I'll get one or two or something like that. I got George on the other night for UNICEF, and a lot of other people, so I can't speak for the Beatles because I'm only me, But if I can get them, if I could get Elvis, I'll try and get them all,
Does that mean that Apple isn't necessarily involved in your peace work either?
Well, I'll probably get all the Apple artists to tell you that. But Apple, I'll try and make Apple pay for a few things,
John, can I ask a question about the Beatles?
Yeah.
As a foursome, do you ever expect to perform again? I know you had a bit of a hang-up with Ringo not wanting to.
Well, it's like a few months ago George didn't. Now he's just been on tour with Bonnie and Delaney and Eric Clapton, and I go off it and on it. And so there's four of us, And I don't know how Ringo feels about it now, but I'm going to try and sew him up for July,
What about the future of the Beatles? Do you expect to remain as a foursome?
I've no idea, I've no idea. If we are comfortable and enjoy being the Beatles, we'll do it. And when we don't, we won't. That's always been the case. For the last 4 years, every time we've made a record, it's been a decision of whether to carry it on from there. Now, the point is, in the old days, Paul and I would knock off an LP and write most of the songs and do it. Now, nowadays, there's three of us writing equally good songs and wanting that much space. And the problem now is, do you make a double album every time, which takes 6 months of your life, or do you make one album, we spend 3 or 4 months making one album, maybe get 2 tracks each? That's the problem, it's just a physical problem, and whether we do it or not, I've no idea,
John, how seriously do you consider the possibility that in your pursuit for peace that your manner of clothing, your hair, would alienate more people than you would ever convince them over your side?
Yes, I understand that. Many people say, well, why don't you get a butch haircut and an eye-tie suit, The thing is, that's what politicians do. I try and be as natural as I can in the circumstances. We do. Politicians do that. Now, how many members of the public are gullible to politicians with a nice picture of the family, the dog,
and a whore on the side, church on Sunday. Now, I could do that. I don't think people would believe it, you know. That is the politician's way. I don't think youth certainly doesn't believe it anymore. You know, and there's a sort of, we have an intuition about having leaving one gate open. There's an old Chinese saying that if the castle falls from within, say like America's, no communists are going to overrun them. The place will collapse from inside. And that always to leave one door open. If you have every door shut in the castle, the enemy will attack from every side and you stand a chance of losing. If you leave one door open, you can concentrate, they'll concentrate there. Our door is hair, or mentioning cold turkey on the MBE, some kind of irrelevancy to distract, so as the attack doesn't hit us, it hits some irrelevancy. And we try and be natural, you know. If I feel like cutting it, I'd cut it.
How did the death of Paul get?
I've no idea. I'm now being credited as a great publicity campaign for the Beatles. Now, if I'd thought of that idea, I don't know how I would have put it into action, and whether I would have done it or not, I don't know. But it's I don't know how it started. It seems to me the same way as the guy that resurrected my comment about Jesus and got publicity for himself in his station, and it got out of his hands. I think it's the same kind of thing. Somebody just, I don't know, I can't understand it myself, you know. What we didn't want to do was become leaders. I believe in that Wilhelm Reich guy who says, don't be a leader, you know. We don't want to be the person people say, it was your fault we didn't get peace, or it was your fault this happened, you know. We want to be part of it. Like the people said the Beatles were the movement. The Beatles were only ever part of a movement. We were influenced as much as we influenced. And John and Yoko refused to be the leader of the youth movement for peace.
That's dictatorship.
That's dictatorship, you know. We want everybody to help us. We're just saying, listen, this is our flag. It's a white flag. You know, anybody else in the game. Well, there's 2 points of view about what happened in this last decade. And I take the positive view. I think the moratorium, Woodstock, Isle of Wight, and all those so-called irrelevancies, and the whole youth movement was what happened in this last decade. And not that the Black Panthers were killed, unfortunately, and all the rest of it. I believe this decade was a positive decade and the start of a new age. So I can only answer you with that, you know. I believe it's a positive decade we've just had. And that it's only the beginning of the change. That's the end of the old regime. When they get that desperate, that's desperation, you know. As Yoko says, you never see a killer smiling. The Beatles were never leaders, but people imagined they were, but now they're finding out, you know. And I won't be a leader, you know, and leaders are people that, you know, it's okay, I will be then, you know, and they have the badge on. Well, I'm not doing that. The only time we took drugs was when we were without hope. And the only way we got out of it was with hope, you know, and if we can sustain the hope, then we don't need liquor, drugs, or anything. But if we lose hope, you know, what is it all? What can you do? What is there to do, you know?
John, you do achieve that success without but could you have achieved that hope without the success of the Beatles?
Oh, the Beatles had nothing to do with the hope, you know. This is after. I mean, the Beatles made it 4 years ago, and they stopped touring, and they had all the money they wanted and all the fame they wanted. And they found out they had nothing. And then we started on our various trips with LSD and Maharishi and all the rest of the things we did. And the old gag about money and power and fame is not the answer. We didn't have any hope just because we were famous. You see all that, Marilyn Monroe and all those other people, they had everything the Beatles had. That's no answer, you know. So we have the same problems. John and Yoko have the same problems and fears and hopes and aspirations that any other couple on earth does. Whether regardless of the position we're in or regardless of the money we have exactly the same paranoias of everybody else, the same petty thoughts, the same, everything goes for us. We have no super answer that came through Beatles or through power. You know, the Beatles in that respect were irrelevant to what I'm talking about. You know.
Despite their well-known socio-political escapades, John and Yoko were amazingly productive during the final hectic days of the late 60s. Legendary rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins, a close friend of Lennon's, remembers some of the strange goings-on out at his place when John and Yoko took up residence.
Everybody was on the grease for him and doing everything that they could. You know, it was almost embarrassing for them, I think. And at that time, they were talking about the land of Bag. I don't know whether you've ever heard that deal or not. No. The land of Bag is a country, and Yoko tried to apply for the United Nations for it, but it's an imaginary. There's no such land, but it's a land of all the right laws and the right rules and no guns, and everybody's happy and everybody helps one another. And no, John wanted me to be the first knight, Sir Ronald the Good Knight. Yeah, and so I got down on my knees, and they went through the whole thing, just like it was England. He and Yoko would be the main king and queen or whatever, because there was a lot of weird things going on there.
You take it with a grain of salt?
Oh, no, I just said, sure, it sounds like fun. I said, you know. So I rose, and I was Sir Ronald the Good Knight. When John explained things, boy, it would be wonderful if the world was like that. He says it's just a dream, he says, but it could be reality, because all people have to do is just stop being greedy. Just stop fighting and killing and being greedy, and the world would just be an unbelievable place. At that time, and when I tell you this, I'm just telling you my opinion, it was more like a mother-son relationship than a husband and wife. Like, we celebrated his 30th birthday, so he was 30 years old, but then after I got to England and found out his background, I could understand it a lot better, because he didn't have a real good childhood. His mother died young, and then the aunt or something, and then something else happened, and then the real tragic thing was after they hit big, all the relatives and friends popped up from all over the world wanting money, and they got to send in nasty letters because they thought he was making $1 billion a minute, and wondered why he wasn't putting them in palaces or something.
As Ronnie remembers it, though within just a few months the Beatles were to be no more, during the latter half of 1969 it was still pretty much hush-hush.
They were trying to keep that a little bit of a secret. I figured out what was going on just from what he said, and that's not because at that time he and Paul weren't speaking at all, you know, and the only business was done, I guess, either through Anthony Fawcett or maybe Yoko with somebody, you know, but at that time it was and nobody dreamed of it, because they still had an album or two coming out. you could just sense it, you know, and I'm sure no one knew that he was coming to town, because he'd just been through on a bed-in, but they came back through for the Peace Festival thing, and we got to see some documentaries on just regular TV from the States of the Beatles when they first landed. You know, he said, boy, that was the most exciting time. He was talking about it because it was, you know, they went up really fast, and to be from Liverpool and nobody to the biggest thing in the world is a hell of a head trip, I'm sure.
John produced 6 top-selling albums during the 70s. The Plastic Ono Band, John Lennon, Imagine, Mind Games, Walls and Bridges, Rock and Roll, and Shaved Fish. By late 1971, though, the Lennons had tired of the laid-back lifestyle they were living in England and returned to New York for good. In June 1972, their 5th and perhaps most uninspired joint album was released. Aptly entitled Sometime in New York City, it was supposed to be a sort of three-penny opera gone rock, but ended up sounding somewhat haphazard and almost trivial. Nevertheless, it represented 2 important milestones in the couple's whirlwind life together. First, its blatantly left-wing lyrics aroused the suspicions of the conservative Nixon government, leading to John's difficulties with the immigration department. Second, it was the last time that John and Yoko seriously recorded together until Double Fantasy was released in 1980. Of all the many myths surrounding the extraordinary life of John Lennon, foremost amongst them is his heralded Lost Weekend. Back then, he split with Yoko and moved out to L.A., spending much time in the company of his great friend, Harry Nilsson.
The Lost Weekend's history. We were bored, and we were at a Joni Mitchell session, and peeing in ashtrays and that sort of thing.
Jumping out of cars?
No, we never did that, as far as I remember.
Spitting up blood?
There was a little bit of that, yeah. But he just announced to the room, it was Warren Beatty, think of his eyes, and Joni Mitchell and Tommy Scott and a few people. And John just suddenly jumped up and says, I'm going to produce Harry Nilsson. And I didn't know whether we were drunk or not, you know, and so a couple of days later he says, what do you think? You know, He woke up earlier. He was shining his shoes at the time. He's a man who shines his own shoes, you know what I mean? I said, if you're serious, man, you bet.
So, what was it like there? You were living in a house with Keith Moon and bloody Ringo and John and everyone. It must have been 24 hours a day, party or what?
No, of course not. You can't do that. We lived a normal, reasonable life. We'd wake up in the morning, well, about 1 o'clock. We'd eat food prepared by this couple we had serving us. And then at first we were very polite, would you mind passing oh, thank you very much. Sugar, please? Oh, thank you. And then after a while it was, Keith, get your nose out of the ammo. And at 6 o'clock, the limos would show up and we'd drive to Warner Brothers and record and finish about 2 o'clock, come home, open up the brandy bottles and listen to the takes very loudly, get drunk and tell each other how good we were. Go to sleep and wake up the next day. So that's relatively normal. It's what people do when they go to 9 to 5s.
Hard times temporarily subsided, however, when, on October 7th, 1975, the U.S. District Court of Appeals overturned a previous deportation order against John, thus ending his 3-year battle to live and work in America. 2 days later, on John's 35th birthday, Sean Ono Taro Lennon was born. Thus, the self-described male chauvinist piglet became the world's most celebrated house husband, steadfastly shunning all offers either to perform or record. One of the most seemingly peculiar aspects of John Lennon's extended stint as a house husband was his almost overwhelming compulsion for, of all things, baking bread. Yoko remembers.
John had that side of just making tea was very natural for him to do. So he'll make the tea for me or whatever. It was very nice,
I baked the bread.
Yes. So there's nothing new about that, really. But we were sort of trying to state that, yes, we can do that too, if you want to, And he had that side, a very vulnerable side. And I have the tough side, I suppose, as well. Just as much as the vulnerable side. So we can all sort of exchange roles once in a while, and that was very natural for us,
All such domestic affairs aside, by August of 1980, John and Yoko were back writing and recording in anticipation of releasing a new album. This was terrifically exciting news for Lennon fans, as it almost certainly meant a world tour. John's first since the Beatles had called it quits back in 1966. Shortly after the release of the single Starting Over, Lennon commented on his current state of mind as regards the almighty business of rock and roll. Why were people angry at me for not working? If I was dead, they wouldn't be angry. If I had conveniently died in the mid-70s after my rock and roll album or Walls and Bridges, they would be writing all this worshipable stuff about what a great guy I was. But I didn't die, and it just infuriated people that I would do what I wanted to. I never could have written Starting Over in 1975. I'm finding myself writing like I used to. These past 5 years have helped me liberate myself from my own intellect and my image of myself. Peter Brown recalls that while visiting John at the Dakota, the widely held view that Lennon had retired from public life, unbelievable as it was true.
I used to say to him, I don't believe you're doing nothing. And he would say, yes, I am.
Despite John's newfound optimism, he was reportedly very nervous about the way that people would react to this, his first fully fledged artistic offering in 5 years. By late November 1980, Double Fantasy was steadily climbing the charts on both sides of the Atlantic. The ex-Beatle, it seemed, was solidly on the comeback trail. Interwoven into Lennon's brief respite of domestic order and sputtering creativity was his often volatile relationship with Yoko. To say that John's final days inside the Dakota were bleak is to understate. So possessive and domineering was Mrs. Lennon that John became little more than a bird in a gilded cage, a cage which would steadfastly hold the reclusive Beatle right up to his senseless murder on December 8th, 1980.
I'll tell you what the plan was. We were going to go to San Francisco that Thursday to join a march, I think the next day, Friday maybe, was it? For equal payment for Oriental people in San Francisco. And it was announced we sent a statement there, and John was very, very happy to do this because John had a son who is half Oriental, you know. So he was envisioning carrying Sean and saying, here's, you know, an equal payment.
Proof of the harmony.
Yes, but that was one of the things we were going to do. I was still sort of shaking in bed, so to speak, and the bedroom was, not now, but the old bedroom that John and I used to sleep in, which is right on the 72nd Street side. So all night, these people were chanting, or they were playing John's record even, you know, so that I hear John's voice, you know, which is really, at the time, was a bit too much. Since John died, too, in the past 2 years, there were many, many things that happened in my life that I just never expected. Very cruel things, terribly heartbreaking things. And it just, you know, it was an experience. I mean, I just had to learn another lesson, you know. And also, you know, because the myth is that the Beatles and Yoko or whatever, you know. And I'd like to say that because until I met John, I didn't really know what the Beatles was about. I suppose I heard about them like most people in those days did, not the fans, but, you know, as a social phenomenon, you know.
Paddy Delaney looks back on the day he first heard the news of John's passing.
I didn't find out until I went to the bus stop to come into town, and one of the fellows that knew me, knew that I'd worked at County, said, "What do you think about John?" I said, "Well, what about John?" He said, "He's dead." I said, "You're joking." Now, immediately, I might have thought, God forgive me, because I've never known John to take drugs. My knowledge of John, I thought of drugs, and then I said, it didn't stop me from asking what happened. He said, "You shot." Oh, Christ. How do you mean shot? In what way? What happened? He said, apparently, some bloke went up. So I came out, you know, stupid fucking Americans, you know. What the hell's going on here? Kennedy, the whole lot. I said, now John Lennon. I said, they're all shooting the wrong people.
Richie York remembers John's legacy to the world.
John's a very misunderstood guy, you know, and a very sincere, dedicated man, you know, a real humanitarian, a man that believed, you know, that things didn't have to be the way they are, that they could be different, you know, if we all set our minds to it. I think all any of us can do is keep the spirit alive, John's spirit, what he was trying to do, you know, like, that's all any of us can do, and I think that anything any of us do in that regard is fantastic, you know.
In a touching quote, Nielsen, too, looks back on his dear friend John.
I miss him very much. I like to say I was a very close friend. I wasn't a very close friend. No one was a very close friend to John other than the Beatles.
Did he miss the Beatles? Was he mournful about what happened over the, you know?
Someone told me a few minutes ago they saw John walking on the street wearing a sign saying, a button rather, saying, "I love Paul." And this girl who told me that said, she asked him, "Why are you wearing the button?" He says, "I love Paul." This is because I love Paul.
Over the years since John's death, there has been much speculation over Paul McCartney's apparently heartless reaction to his former partner's passing. As Wings co-commander Denny Lane tells us, however, it was very far from the truth.
All I know is that the next day...
What were you working on?
We went into work.
What were you working on?
God knows.
Tug of war?
I don't know. Yeah, probably.
Okay.
George Martin was there, Jeff Emerick. It was at Air Studio. I was at George's studio, George Martin's studio. Now, this was the strange thing that happened was that I went into work sort of knowing, you know, I sort of knew that Paul would come into work anyway, because the best way to deal with anything like that is to keep working, take your mind off it as much as possible, be around your friends, whatever. And although I expected a call to say Paul won't be coming in today, I kind of knew in the back of my mind he probably would be there, maybe late or whatever. But anyway, he was driving up from Sussex and he turned up. And as usual, you know, noon, we were sitting there and he went, "I don't believe it." You know, he was obviously physically shaken. He didn't know what to say, really. He didn't know how to say things. And we were looking like out the window, you know, Air Studios like 6 floors up in Oxford Circus, looking right down on, you know, on the middle of London. And down at the bottom, a truck went by, a dark green truck went by, and it said Lennon furnishing or something like that. Lennon something. And I went, look at that. And he, you know, and then he started to talk. And he said, look, he said, I'll tell you something, I'm never going to fall out with anybody again in my life for that amount of time and have the possibility of somebody dying before I get a chance to square it with them.
What about the way they hounded him for saying it's a drag?
Well, it's a drag because what else do you say? What do you do? Write a book there and then, you know, you might burst out into tears, who knows? You know.
So he just wanted to get away from you.
Yeah, he wanted to get away from anybody asking him questions. And I certainly never asked him any questions. I waited for him to talk, and if he wanted to, he did, and if he didn't, he didn't.
After John had left us, the accolades from friends and family began to roll in from around the world. Amongst them were 5 particularly touching tributes. Donovan recalls the real John Lennon.
He had a wicked tongue. He could, I mean, his word, when you were talking to him, or he was in the room, or he said something about something, well, we all know this. He had such a wicked tongue that he could cut people right to the quick.
He wasn't cruel, was he?
No, he was honest. And that was, to a fault, he was honest. Therefore, people considered him to be very hard and forward. But that's the way he protected his sensitivity, by saying exactly what he felt. And he was a very sensitive man inside, and it was a great loss to the world. I remember, everybody remembers exactly where they were when it happened. And he does rank with Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Gandhi as a figure for peace in the world. That his passing was. There was a great shock wave right across the world, you know, and people felt it right to the... And you never know what you've got until you lose it. You know, you never, like in the blues, the old blues, they sing, you never miss your water till your well runs dry. And that's what happened. We didn't miss John until he'd gone. We didn't really appreciate him until he'd gone, you know.
Outrageous 60s crooner Tiny Tim, too, was touched by the great work of John Lennon.
Sorry, unfortunately, a great tragedy for America that he had to be shot in this country. But at the same time, America also made the Beatles, and so in a sense, you know, it's equalized in one respect. But still, it's an unfortunate situation. I performed a number on a show which I don't think was put on the air, but I sang a tribute to John Lennon. And it went something like this. Here lies John Lennon, in life sang many songs. He had his joy and sorrow, was oft times sad at heart. May his sleep here be peaceful, beneath God's clear blue sky, while passing drop of flower where John Lennon lies.
Stand By Me man Benny King had this to say.
I think that out of all the writers I've known over the years, and I've known quite a lot, I have a lot of respect for him as a great writer. And as a singer, he's fantastic. He doesn't have a great voice. He puts me in mind of, in the Blackfield, Otis Redding, who didn't have a great voice, but had a great way of delivering. He had a feeling, you know, and James is like that. No great voice, but what a feeling, what a deliverance, you know, like, ooh, natural-born, you know, storytellers with words, yeah.
In a 1984 press conference in New Zealand, the usually tight-lipped George Harrison remembered John.
Everybody in this room has had friends who've died, or parents or relatives or something. It's not a particularly happy affair at the best of times, let alone when some loony does it. It affects you the same as Gandhi or Mrs. Gandhi or Kennedy, anybody, except it's a bit closer to home, that's all.
The last word, however, belongs to former Cavern Club compere and early Beatles crony Bob Wooler, who made this emotional statement when I first spoke to him in Liverpool in 1983.
I said to a press guy, at the end of this century, your media, etc., will choose 100 people who were part of the 20th century, like Einstein or Roosevelt or Churchill or Hitler even, and you can rest assured John Lennon will be one of them. And he said, he wasn't indignant, but he said, do you think so? I said, of course. Of course. I did a short tribute to John, and I called it Shooting Star. Shooting star, teardrop in the sky. Sparks strike up. You struck sparks. Your name will not die. That's it.
During those first few days following the tragedy, the media covered the story with a fierce devotion reserved only for the world's elite. Lennon's chiseled image was everywhere. Radios, newspapers, and the telly continuously broadcast details of both the world's reaction and the terrible crime itself with deadly regularity. Yoko herself issued a statement to the media in the harrowing aftermath of that fateful night. I told Sean what happened, it began. I showed him the picture of his father on the cover of the paper and explained the situation. I took Sean to the spot where John lay after he was shot. Sean wanted to know why the person shot John if he liked John. I explained that he was probably a confused person. Sean said that we should find out if he was confused or if he really had meant to kill John. I said that's up to the court. He asked, what court? A tennis court or a basketball court? That's how Sean used to talk with his father. They were buddies. John would have been proud of Sean if he had heard this. Sean cried later. He also said, now Daddy is part of God. I guess when you die, you become much bigger because you're part of everything. I don't have much more to add to Sean's statement. The silent vigil will take place on December 14th at 2 p.m. for 10 minutes. Within hours of the composer's death, both Paul McCartney and George Harrison issued press releases illuminating their views on the tragedy. After all we went through together, I had and still have great love and respect for him, wrote Harrison. I am shocked and stunned. To rob life is the ultimate robbery. This perpetual encroachment on other people's space is taken to the limit with the use of a gun. It is an outrage that people can take other people's lives when they obviously haven't even gotten their own in order. Adds McCartney, John was a great man who will be sadly missed by the world, but remembered for his unique contributions to art, music, and world peace. Several other people once close to Lennon were besieged by the press in pursuit of their feelings in the tragedy. Two figures whom the media very aggressively stalked were Aunt Mimi and John's first wife, Cynthia. Both women, however, were virtually overcome with grief and only reluctantly consented to talk after it became apparent that it would ultimately be much easier than not talking. Since his mother died, John had always looked upon me as his mum, said Mimi. There was never any possibility that he would be just an ordinary person. He would have been successful in anything he did. He was always just as happy as the day was long. I will never recover. Obviously as much in love with John as ever, Cynthia, too, was predictably crushed. A violent and untimely death like Lennon's leaves everyone who admired him with a mixed bag of very raw, unresolved emotion. Despite his tragic passing, however, John Lennon continues to mean a tremendous amount to millions around the globe. Even more, his timeless music is almost certain to endure for generations, a beacon of personal freedom, collective hope, magical daydreams, and goodwill that will likely shine forever. And for that, we thank you, John, most heartily.
My position on violence is I don't believe in it. I think we all have violent tendencies. I think it can be channeled. I think violence begets violence, as proved by the various marches and things that always end up with cops and people getting beaten up, or cops beating up people, or whatever it is. And I think marching and placards was okay for the 30s when people wanted bread, and then it sort of had some impact on people. But nowadays people are blasé about war and they're blasé about placards and marching. And I think there's many ways of protesting, and this bed-in is one of them.
Geoffrey Giuliano is the author of some 30 internationally best-selling books on the Beatles, John Lennon, and other iconic musicians of the 1960s. In 2006, his book, Paint It Black, The Murder of Brian Jones, was made into a film by Stephen Woolley and Nick Powell entitled Stoned, The Wild and Wicked World of Brian Jones. It remains a cult classic and the only film bio of the Rolling Stones. Giuliano is also a veteran journalist, having written for dozens of high-profile newspapers and magazines, including The Sunday People, The Daily Mail, The News of the World, The Mail on Sunday, Playgirl, and Rolling Stone. A noted film actor, Giuliano starred in such movies as Vikingdom, Scorpion King 3, Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, The Fifth Execution, Far Cry 3, Fire Desire, among many. In addition, he hosted the long-running North American syndicated radio series, Geoffrey Giuliano's Roots of Rock, for 5 years, as well as pioneering the audiobook industry in the 1990s by authoring, narrating, and producing over 250 original, non-book-based, interview-driven productions. Giuliano's publishers included Random House, HarperCollins, Delta Entertainment, Durkin Hayes, Playaway Audio, Speechworks, and B&B Audio, among dozens more internationally. In 1998, Random House acquired his firm Tribute Audio, for which Giuliano acted as CEO and publisher for 5 years. His best-selling audiobook, That Fateful Night, True Stories of Titanic Survivors in Their Own Words, was nominated for a Grammy. In 2014, Geoffrey Giuliano founded Icon Editions and G2 Media Arts to market his updated works as well as publish new projects. As a visual artist, Geoffrey has been showing in galleries across America since 1977, garnering impressive reviews. His first professional assignment was designing several T-shirts for The Who's Pete Townsend in 1976. Geoffrey also designed and illustrated many of his original rock biographies for the biggest publishers in the world from 1984 to 2006, as well as designing for his pioneering record label, Samba Records, in the mid-1990s. From 2006 to 2011, Geoffrey was also the primary designer for the French fashion house Cotai. When Giuliano first conceived of creating his own literary imprint, Icon Editions, he became responsible for illustrating and designing 35 book covers, several hundred CDs, DVDs, as well as dozens of promotional posters, and eventually an entire collection of exclusive fashion and art. The expansive Design by Giuliano brand grew out of Geoffrey's impressive commitment to the arts and is the culmination of a lifetime's work by an extraordinarily talented and determined Renaissance man.
Peach and Love Records. Thank you for listening.